Yae Miko, like many characters, is one released before her time, and as time goes on, Yae has received buff after buff until now she has a very wide range of quite strong team options and is both one of the more flexible and powerful characters in the game. That being said, there are a lot of units that can exist in her role, so the value she provides to most accounts is often questioned, and many people find her playstyle not to their taste. However, she does have a ton of good strengths, and I found myself really loving her new teams. So let's talk about whether or not she's the right pull for you and how to make the most out of her if you decide to get her. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Yae Miko is a 5-star Electro Catalyst DPS character who has both on-field and off-field presence depending what role you need her to fill in the team. She sets up 3 turrets with her skill to do max damage and needs to refresh them after they expire, as well as refresh after using her burst, which consumes the totems to do max damage. She scales both off attack and elemental mastery, meaning she is flexible with how you build her and can utilize different builds for different teams, and of course she works especially well with Dendro. She does have some issues being a fully off-field unit because her field time requirements are a little bit higher than a lot of other units, especially the often compared to Fischl. She does also have some downsides for being an on-field unit, with her normal attacks being a little bit clunky and aren't the highest scaling. However, when used as a quick swap unit, a dual DPS, or in a team where electro application is very important, these weaknesses are often negligible or eliminated because of her high damage and flexibility. She's also a very strong overworld character, has a pretty high skill floor as she does damage even if you're knocked around or miss optimal combos, and is actually quite free to play friendly with a large variety of build options. But of course, the most important thing is how she actually feels in teams, and she's had quite a few new ones in Fontaine that feel to me like some of her best ever. So let's talk about them now. By the way, we are getting extremely close to completing my goal of building and testing every single character. As you can see, I just have 2 left on my account that are unbuilt, and a final 3 that are just up to Hoyoverse until I can get my hands on them. Personally find it very important for me to actually build every character on my account because there are so many different combinations available, and I want to test them all personally, and as new characters come out, I want to test them with those new characters and just give you the best opinion I possibly can. So if you like this goal, I would really appreciate a subscribe to the channel. Thanks a lot. First team I want to cover is one that was featured in the Genshin Scientist recent Yae Miko guide, and he covered a lot of great stuff, some of which I'm going to share for you in this video. Make sure to check out his channel. I've linked it in the description. I watch pretty much every single one of the Genshin Scientist videos, and I highly recommend that you do too. A team that's actually been popular for a long time is Yae Miko Hyperbloom, and Yae Miko Hyperbloom is one that I have never enjoyed really at all. I just find that Yae Miko Hyperbloom or Quick Bloom is just worse than regular Hyperbloom or even Sino Quick Bloom, and the main reason is because I just don't feel that her electro application from her skills, like obviously it's very hard to proc Hyperblooms with because they have single target properties. So unless that the Hyperblooms are very, very close to the enemies, they won't get procced, and then you have to use normal attacks or charge attacks, which it can be clunky, and I don't like. I like it for it to be smoother, and I find that it's not very smooth. But this Hyperbloom team, because it uses plunge attack, and Yae Miko's plunge attacks have a very wide electro AoE, as do all plunge attack, and because you're spamming plunges and just really not doing normal attacks at all, this Hyperbloom, this Quick Bloom team to me feels actually great, and I think that this really cements her as a great character for this. Plus, you can always it's a more free-flowing quick swap one than Sino, so if you start a new rotation, you're not tied to anyone's burst. Obviously, you're going to want to cast Farina's and Xinyan's and Nahida's burst as they all contribute to the team, and obviously Yae Miko's burst, you don't have to build energy for it because the 90 cost is just too much energy recharge to get to every single rotation, so you just use it when it's available. The rotation is very easy. I was actually opening with Yae Miko, but opening with Farina can be the best idea, then using Yae Miko's skills and then a normal attack to make sure you have Electro, using Shenyan's skill and burst to swirl, and then using Nahida to apply her skill and burst. You do want to use Nahida last, because if you would use her first, you won't be able to swirl Shenyan with Shenyan properly because of the Dendro aura. There aren't really any 4-star alternatives to this particular playstyle, but you can still use Yae Miko on a Hyperbloom team. Like, if you don't have, see, even though I'm not that much of a fan of Yae Miko Hyperbloom, if you don't have a Kuki, like, you only have so many choices. So you can go Yae Miko, double Hydro Hyper Bloom, or this doesn't have a healer. So, you know, you can use Zhongli, you can use Baizhu, you can use Kirara, you can use Kuki and use them together. That will battery Yae. Like, Hyper Bloom is such a strong reaction at a baseline, and Yae Miko does good damage at a baseline, and she wants to build Elemental Mastery at least to some degree anyways, and Nahida is buffing Elemental Mastery, so Yae Miko is perfectly good in Hyper Bloom, Quick Bloom, whatever. I would always build her for damage because she does do really good damage all the time. You can also drive with Kokomi, so you have something like this. This one really will struggle to proc Hyper Blooms. You'll want to make sure that you swap into Yae Miko fairly often to do normal attack if you're driving with Kokomi. But yeah, Yae Miko Hyper Bloom, Yae Miko Quick Bloom, both good options. Next is the classic Aggravate, where Yae Miko is driving Fischl through her normal attack, using her skills, using her burst when available. You're getting great AoE damage and buffing from Kazuha, and then Baizhu or Yao Yao or Kirara are going to be in this spot. I personally prefer Baizhu and Kirara because not only do they buff Aggravate a little bit, but they give Yae Miko some interruption resistance, which for a team like this really feels nice to have. It's not as crucial when looking at a team such as this because Plunge has very high interruption resistance, so you very rarely get staggered with this team, and Zhenyan provides plenty of healing so that you always feel very topped up and comfy. But for one like this, we're using Yae's normal and charge attack, having someone like Kirara or Baizhu for some extra interruption resistance really nice. I definitely feel like this team, although still very good and still very good in AoE, I especially like running like Sacrificial Sora and Kazuha to get some extra grouping and extra AoE with his skill. I feel like in the current meta, like the way that the Abysses have been, it's not as good as it used to be because there aren't as many groupable characters. Kazuha is not as ubiquitous and as good as he was in the Abysses lately. That's not to say that it won't come back. It just feels like lately there's a lot of ruin enemies, a lot of ungroupable enemies that get shields or get stagger resistance like the Eremites, and they can't very easily be grouped together. That's not to say that the team is good. That's not even still one of her best teams or one of the best teams overall. I'm not in love with it as much as I used to be. You can obviously replace Kazuha with Sucrose, especially in single target. This is technically just as good or better than Kazuha, but I have always enjoyed the personal damage that Kazuha brings to the table, as well as just the way better grouping. Another thing to keep in mind is for Kirara, if you don't have her Constellation 4, like I don't, you will want to make sure that you swap into her often enough to get that Dendro application on the enemies. And then Fischl here, generally not recommended to be replaced, but like you can, you know, just put a different Electro here. You can run Raiden and Yae dual DPS if you want to. You can do Kuki or whatever, but Fischl is just so good for Aggravate, she's hard to replace. Next is the spread teams, where Yae Miko is the secondary DPS for either Alhaitham or Tainari are the two spread DPSs at the moment. And you're also going to run Nahida if you can. Of course, a different character can work. And then the final slot is going to be your defensive utility, can be Kuki. If you're doing Kuki, you want to do Instructor and Sapwood Blade for maximum buffing, or you can do Zhongli. That's a great option too. You can also do Baizhu for a third Dendro, I guess. You can also do Baizhu here or Kirara and then put a second Electro, I suppose, to Fischl. Yae Miko is sort of a little bit better than Fischl in these teams, especially in AoE where she can use her burst here and there, but not like, I wouldn't say it's like worth it from a meta perspective to necessarily pull Yae, although I do think it is the ceiling overall by a little bit for this team. And I personally enjoy the Yae Miko Alhaitham teams the most. I forgot to say you can swap Kazuha out for Zhongli on a team like this, but losing the resistance shred that Viridescent Venerer gives you is, in my opinion, not really worth it. It does allow you to run Nahida, so if you do have a C2 Nahida, it can be a okay option. But if you've got a C2 Nahida, then I definitely recommend, you know, one of the Hyper Bloom, you know, like the Quick Bloom teams like this, like C2 Farina, C2 Nahida. This has a lot of room for vertical investment. Something like this doesn't as much, and the spread team definitely does. The other one I wanted to bring up is sort of the dual DPS with Raiden, Yae Miko, Farina, Jean, or Shen Yun in this last slot. This isn't my favorite Raiden Yae team. It's just one that I've used, and that's decent. It can work. Something you can try out if you want, but it's like not my favorite. But Yae Miko Chevreuse is something, or Chevreuse is something that I really actually love. And of course, you can run Yae Miko by herself, although Xiangling's energy needs are very, very high in this team compared to using Raiden. So I actually personally like using Raiden and Chevreuse with Yae Miko together. And you can either use Xiangling as your pyro and use Chevreuse as your only healer, or you can run Bennett. I think obviously for the lower constellation Chevreuse build, Bennett will be better here. You will lose a bit of uptime on Chevreuse towards the end of rotation because you're not consistently proccing overloadeds. This can be omitted by doing a little quick normal attack on your Raiden before going into a burst state. So the rotation here is Yae Miko set up her skill turrets, Chevreuse, burst, and skill. You can do the 3 skills if you have C4, 4 or just the 1. If you don't, then Bennett's skill and burst. You're going to burst with Yae Miko, set up your 3 skills again, then normal attack with Raiden to proc an overloaded, then go into her burst. I didn't actually do that when I was playing this team. I just did it normally, but that way you're going to keep Chevreuse passive. You waste a tiny bit of Bennett uptime, but you're going to keep Chevreuse's passive into the end of Raiden's burst, which is very, very valuable. And then if you do have a higher constellation Chevreuse, then the healing is much more manageable and you can get away with Xiangling. Obviously, her energy needs here without Bennett are a little high, and not snapshotting Bennett, you know, not as good, but she still gets the attack buff from Chevreuse, and you don't need to play Encircle Impact, which is really nice, and you don't need to worry about Bennett uptime, which is really nice. And so overall, I really like this team. I like it a lot. It's, if you want to do Raiden Yae, which I know a lot of us do, right? A lot of us want to use Raiden Yae together, and this is the premier way of using Raiden Yae these days, in my opinion. I used to use Bennett Kazuha. I've pretty much completely phased out that team completely. Like, I have so much footage on my computer from when I used to play this team a lot, and it was one of my favorite teams. But with Dendro, this team sort of fell behind, and I still used it. I still loved it. But now, with the introduction of Chevreuse, the dual DPS is alive and well again, and it feels so much better than anything we've had with a dual DPS before. So either one of these are great options. I love them both. You can also use Yae Miko in Taser, of course. You can use Kokomi. I think this is the best Taser variant for Yae Miko at the moment. Of course, using Fischl in Yae Miko's place or Rado is good too. But this team doesn't really mind giving Yae Miko the field time to use her skills, because it's not like you're losing out on anything else. She takes good advantage of Furina, and so does Kokomi, and Kazuo's buffing everyone. This is a great AoE team. Yae Miko's burst is also AoE, whereas Fischl doesn't have anything AoE. So overall, I like this team. I think this is a good team. You can also just slot Yae Miko into anything. Like, you can put her in Navia, and I've got Fischl as this last slot, but you could have Bennett here. And Yae Miko could just be sort of a slot in for a lot of different teams. You can slot her into Novelette as well. You know, these things aren't like particularly optimal, but they are good options. It's also nice to use her for stuff that doesn't like need normal attacks to proc it, like Sayu. If you're doing like Sayu aggravate, well, then you want Fischl. That's one of the things, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But a lot of the times that you'd slot her in to a team, Fischl is generally the better slot in, because she can snapshot buffs like Bennett, which means she gets Bennett's attack buff even when she's off field, and she just takes more field time than Fischl. So she's generally a worse slot in character than Fischl, but like Fischl's not like you can't do Hyper Bloom Fischl, you can't do Quick Bloom Fischl, you can't do Fischl aggravate because she's the person that you're aggravating with. Spread Fischl, that is good. Fischl's also good here on a team like this. But let me know your favorite Yae Miko teams. I might have missed some here, but I think this is sort of my favorite and very slept on Yae Miko team. But all of the ones I've mentioned are more than capable of clearing the abyss and feeling very, very good. For gameplay tips and rotations, the biggest one I have is, well, for this one, it's the dash cancel plunge. So you're plunging and then dashing immediately and then jumping and plunging. And overall, my tips for Yae are, make sure if you're driving aggravate to use your normal attack, and don't worry too much about using your burst every single rotation, because it's too much energy to get her burst up. For a lot of teams, Fischl teams, it can. Raiden teams, it can. But pretty much all the other teams, you can't. So like this team, she's not going to be bursting every rotation. But with Raiden, she will be. The other thing I want to say is try and line up your burst and your burst so that you're using it towards the expiry of your skill. So your skill totems last 14 seconds. So you want to line up your burst to use it towards the end of this 14 seconds. So generally, if you're going to be using Yae's burst, you want to open up the rotation or close to the opening of the rotation with her skill, so it has the duration of the rotation to do damage. Then when you go back to Yae, you can use her burst, set up the skills again, and then do what you were going to do, rather than using the 3 skills immediately bursting, then using the 3 skills again. That can be a bit more of a waste. You want to try and weave it in if you can, even if it means delaying the burst a bit, especially if you're not bursting on a set rotation. It can be a bit tricky to keep in mind. Like, sometimes I end up bursting when my totems have already expired, which is annoying, but it's something that you'll get used to as you play her more. And you know, the teams I provide are all plenty strong that you don't have to worry about that if you don't want. For levels, almost like most of Yae's teams that use Dendro, you do really want to be level 90. So Aggravate or Hyper Bloom, Quick Bloom, etc. Level 90 is an absolute must. Taser teams is not. 80 is going to be fine. And the Raiden Chevreuse teams, I do still recommend going to 90 because she is going to be proccing some overloadeds and you're going to be having some EM on her likely left over from your other build. So although you're not going to build her for fully EM on overloads or like really high EM, she's still going to be proccing a bunch of overloaded. So having level 90, having EM on her is still good for those teams. So I do think overall you want to 90 your Yae. That's something you want to do. She is one of the higher priority characters to 90 for most of her teams. For talents, depending on the team, all of them can be important. Like even though her burst, you're not going to be using it every single rotation, it does a lot of damage. Like the scaling on it is good. So you don't want to neglect her burst. You do want to level it. You really want to level her skill. Obviously, that's generally the most important part of her damage. And her normal attacks for Aggravate and for Plunge are important to level. Not as important as the other two, even though you are using them a lot, because for the Plunge, she is utilizing Shenyun's buff a lot. So her levels don't matter as much. And she's proccing Fischl for Aggravate. So again, they don't matter as much, but you do want to level them. I'm pretty high. I would probably prefer this to go up to 8. I just don't have, the resources right now because I'm working on other characters, but I'm probably going to get her to 998. Maybe I'll even crown her one day. I love using Raiden, Yae, Chevreuse together, and both my Yae and my Raiden are still C0. So, everything you're seeing is achievable. Chevreuse is C6, but I did test Chevreuse even when she was at C0 and it was still very good. You can check out that footage in my Chevreuse guide. Not as crazy, not maybe top team like these feel, but still very good. I will say compared to when I did the Raiden Chevreuse guide, the Chevreuse guide, I like Raiden Yae with Chevreuse more than I did then. So that's, I'm very happy about that. For weapons, generally, obviously her signature is going to be the best. Little baby Yae Miko. For her weapons, obviously her signature is generally her best in slot. Although if you are using her in Aggravate and especially Hyper Bloom teams, Nahida's signature can be pretty much just as good. Both Cash Flow Supervision and Tome of the Eternal Flow are good stat sticks, so you can consider those as well. Genshin Silence end up making weapon guides for each different team, which is super useful. So if you're playing Hyper Bloom, you can pick the best out of this list. If you're playing Aggravate, you have this list. Flowing Purity, by the way, is the Fontaine craftable and is actually really good for her. It might make you lean towards playing a healer as opposed to a shielder on your teams, which is totally fine. Giving attack and elemental damage bonus after using an elemental skill, this is perfect for Yae. So if you're free to play, this is definitely going to be your go-to. I personally, if I could go back in time, I would build this over the Widsith just because I don't like the inconsistency of the Widsith for testing. But in general, the Widsith is a better free-to-play option overall. So yeah, 5 stars, Kagura's Very 1,000 Floating Dreams. I haven't seen actually people, I know these are good stat sticks, so you can use them if you already have them being raised, but they're really just that. They're stat sticks. They're probably, I mean, if I'm not seeing them calc, they're probably worse than the free-to-play options. Let me know in the comments if you actually have seen anyone do calc on these two, because I'm kind of curious. I would use them if you have them built, but don't get them for her and probably lean towards the other options like Widsith if you don't have them. Skyward Atlas is actually a good option for her, especially in Quicken builds, because she does use attack a lot. It's not a good option for Quick Bloom, but this is a good option for Raiden Chevreuse, or just Chevreuse in general, for the Quicken ones, for Taser, for teams where she's just doing raw damage more, and not as good for the Quick Bloom, Hyper Bloom ones. Lost Prayer is a solid stat stick as well. For 4-star, it's basically going to be just Widsith, or as we talked about, the Flowing Purity. So that's that right there. That's really it. Flowing Purity is super good as a free-to-play baseline, and the others just don't. There's just no real point in the other ones because it's craftable. But the Widsith obviously is, like, the buffs that it gives are so massive, and she can actually is one of the few characters that actually does take advantage of all 3 buffs. So whether you get attack, whether you get elemental damage bonus, whether you get EM, all 3 are good for her. So really good choice. If you start with her in the first party, she doesn't get the buff immediately, which is good because you can set up your totems, go off, do your setup, come back, use her burst, then she'll get the Widsith buff. So it's a good idea to have her first in your party if you are for that reason. For artifacts, this is one of the characters that even after all this time, I still recommend a 2-piece, and that's still what I use. Depending on what she's doing, you can do 2-piece EM, 2-piece electro damage bonus, 2-piece attack, and you can even do Gilded Dreams, the 2-piece skill damage. For Quick Bloom, Aggravate, etc., the Gilded Dreams is going to be her best because it just gives the most stats. On some teams where she doesn't use your burst as often and she's doing more damage versus reaction damage, the Golden Troop can be better. I generally wouldn't recommend building the Golden Troop for her, like farming it for her specifically, because if you want to use her in a variety of teams, I would stick to a 2-piece attack, 2-piece 2-piece electro damage bonus. That's kind of like covering your bases. But if you are going to play her mostly in quick bloom, then I do recommend going for the Gilded Dreams, because that extra elemental mastery is going to be big. In most teams, elemental mastery and attack are going to be pretty close. Some teams elemental mastery is a little bit better, sometimes attack's a little bit better, and that goes for the Sands as well. It's a must to have an elemental mastery Sands for the quick bloom teams, but for aggravate, even for Chevreuse, even though I should be using attack for the Chevreuse teams, I left the elemental mastery one on, and she's still, like, you saw the footage, it was crazy. So yeah, you should go for attack, but this is fine. It's all fine if you happen to have it. You do want to go electro damage bonus. That doesn't really change unless you're going with Farina, I suppose. And then if you're using Farina, you can go with EM for both Sands and Goblet, and you're doing that Farina hyper plunge. That's what it is. Hyper plunge. Anyway, and then obviously crit rate or crit damage for the mask. You don't want to go full EM. Even if you're doing hyper bloom, she does a lot of personal damage on any team that she's doing, so you do not want to forego crit stats on her, and that's what you want to prioritize for the stats. You know, your crit rate damage. This is kind of a nuts build, so you know, take this with a grain of salt, but this is a two-piece, right? This is a two-piece. So yeah, I have nutty stats. Those are super nutty. Holy crap. What kind of crit ratio is this? And we have EM in these substats as well. This is a nutty build. But anyways, it's a two-piece. So you can collect your best two-piece from all over the map. Like, you get Gladiator for free, you get Wander's Troop for free, and you're gonna be, you know, farming. You may not. Thundering Furies in the strong box. Gilded Dreams is a very resin efficient domain to farm. So yeah, obviously you can use Marie-José Hunter in the Farina team. That's going to do a lot for her personal damage, and the Hyper Blooms will not do as much. I would tend to go for the Gilded Dreams, but this is a great op too, especially since you've probably already farmed this if you farmed for Farina. So if no one else is using it, then this is definitely what I'd recommend. The best artifact set for Yae is the one that you have, and that you have with good stats on. So highly recommend just giving her whatever good stuff you have. That's one of the best things about Yae, I think, is she's got very free to play weapons and very free to play artifact sets and a ton of good teams. So that's really nice. As far as energy recharge, we talked about it before. I have 0 energy recharge, and she can burst every rotation with Raiden. But I do have Favonius on my Xiangling for some reason. So I do recommend maybe 120 ER if you're using her with Raiden, because I have had times where she's struggled to get her ER back if no one's on Favonius. And then if you're not using her with Raiden, then I do recommend 0 ER and just using her when you have her burst up. For vertical investment, her Constellation 1 and 2 are solid. Like, they give her a pretty solid boost for herself. Like, this gives her more energy. This allows her to much more easily burst every rotation. And it is worth building ER for her to burst every rotation if you get her C1. Make sure you, like, this makes your ER requirement 0 for Raiden, and then makes it much lower for other teams. And then C2 increases her skill damage, as well as increasing their range. I'd say the range is more useful for the Overworld, not as much for the Abyss, since they've got a pretty good range already. But increasing the stacks, which increases the damage, is big. Like, that's really nice. One of the characters I would definitely stop at C2 if you're going for vertical investment on her specifically. But overall, for vertical investment in general, you're gonna hear this a lot. Like, if you're using her on Farina teams, her Farina C2 is better to get really than her own personal damage. If you're using her on Yae Miko team, or if you're using her on Nahida teams, then you definitely want to go for Nahida C2. But because I'm thinking about this more, because she's so flexible and you're probably using her on a lot of different teams, if you're maining Yae Miko, like, getting her constellations is nice. You probably like seeing her burst, as I do, and so you probably like using her burst if you're Yae Miko main. So getting C1 and C2 probably are kind of nice because they kind of go with you overall. So if you're going for, like, overall account value, then you don't go for Yae Miko constellations. But then at that point, we'll talk about this in a minute. Well, maybe we'll talk about it now. For account value, you don't really go for Yae Miko in general. There's just better other characters that you should go for. Like, she's a DPS. DPS is a DPS. There's lots of good DPSs. It's more important, like, you only have one DPS, you have lots of off field, and she is flexible, so she is a solid character to go for. She brings you value if you get her, but you don't get her because of value. I think she has good value once you get her. Once you get her, there's lots of things you can do with her, but I don't think that she brings so much to the table that I would recommend, like, a new player pick her up over Raiden, right? Over even a Nilou, over, obviously, I'm not even comparing her to support characters, but over a Hu Tao, over a Nouvelette. She doesn't bring so much value through her flexibility that I'd recommend her over those, but once you get her, she has a lot of value to add by being so flexible, by being so free to play friendly. So I think she's a really great character overall, but doesn't hit like the ceilings of power or the ceilings of value. But I think she is very much above average in both of those things. And I don't think that anyone who gets her, as long as you enjoy her playstyle, as long as you can get used to using her and you like using her, I don't think that people are going to regret getting her these days, especially with the introduction of all the Fontaine stuff we've talked about. So for vertical investment for her, and her weapon does give her a lot as well. Like as we saw from the Genshin Scientist, like overusing free-to-play options, you know, it's a decent upgrade. Definitely a better damage upgrade than her C1. If you're wondering whether it's C1 or weapon, it should be her weapon. If you're going all the way to C2, you know, maybe her C2 has a bit more value. I think this is about a 15% DPS increase, depending, and then this is about a 30. Because if you don't need the ER, then it's a 0% increase. But I think she always needs a bit of ER, so you know, 5 to 15% here, and then another 15% here. C2 over her weapon, but that's way more primo gem. So in that case, her weapon. That being said, I think this weapon banner is kind of sus. The whole banner itself is kind of sus, but I think also the quality of life from the C1 and C2 are nice. So up to you. Either way, I would say weapon first, but her free to play weapon is quite good. So yeah, they're all like decent choices. You have to have a bit of critical thinking and know what you want, what you're going to get the most value out of. But of course, if you are using her, if you are comparing her vertical investment to something like Farina C2, Yae to C2, then those always win out. Just to finish up on value and power level, since we're kind of intermingling these, it's also, I want to compare her to Fischl. Fischl is more splashable. They're a bit more different than I think people give them credit for. Like, sure, you can slap Yae into all the things that Fischl does, but that will kind of be a downgrade. Whereas you can't really slap Fischl into the things that Yae does. So both of them have, I think, distinct roles. Fischl works when you need more energy for the team, when you can proc her A4 like aggravate, when you can snapshot buffs, when you want single target damage, and when you want low field time. Yae Miko doesn't provide energy. She does more damage, but she has more field time. So they're just strong in different areas. And I think Yae Miko versus, you know, someone like Lisa, I wouldn't pull Yae Miko just for aggravate, but you've seen all the things that Yae Miko can do. Lisa can do all those things, but does them worse, you know, but she still does them well. So she, you know, you can get away without pulling Yae for all of her team. I also didn't mention Kujo-Sara for the team section. You can use Kujo-Sara on our team, especially the Chevreuse teams or whatever, and buff Yae's burst with Kujo-Sara, but it's going to be hard to get her burst up every rotation to actually get that buff. So maybe if your Yae is like C1 or C2 or C1, it's easier to use Kujo-Sara, but overall still, like, she's made for Raiden. You can force her in, but not as good. Compared to Sino, these days, I kind of prefer, like, again, as I said earlier, I used to prefer Sino for Quick Bloom and prefer Yae for Aggravate, but nowadays with the plunge, I kind of almost prefer Yae for Quick Bloom as well. I'll have to do more testing. I definitely think that Yae is the more better and more valuable character than Sino. Like, Sino hasn't gotten worse, don't get me wrong. And I haven't tried out his plunge stuff. I'll try out his plunge. I have to try out his plunge stuff before I can really say for sure. To be honest, the reason why I haven't is because in the beginning, I didn't think that he could plunge while he was in his burst state. So, you know, my huge apologies for not testing that out, but I will. And finally, versus Keqing, I mean, it's similar to Sino. Like, Keqing can perform in almost all the ways that we talked about for Yae, but she just has lower scaling, so she's, you know, a bit worse, but still good. So similar kind of thing. Like, if you have a build Keqing, you know, you don't have to go for Yae, blah, blah, blah. Yae will be an upgrade, but is not like a crazy, totally new character. I don't think plunge Keqing will be as good, although she probably can plunge in her electro state. So I should try that out too. Man, there's so many more things to test. This is exciting. But the overall versus others is get her if you like her. She will be an upgrade, but you can definitely skip her if you don't want her, because there are other great opt-outs. For future prospects, I think the fact that Chevreuse exists means that there will always be options for Yae in the Pyro Electro category, so a different alternative to Raiden, different alternative to Xiangling, and also that Dendro exists. There can be future options for, you know, if there's a new Dendro character, a new Anemo character, new whatever, a new version of Fischl. Like, I can see there being future potential for Yae for sure, especially since she's not a fully on-fielder and she has some off-field potential. I definitely think that her future potential potential is actually good. Don't pull for future potential, but I think that she'll probably get some more buffs in the future, to be honest. And as far as Overworld, she's one of my favorite Overworld characters. Hits annoying enemies, hovering enemies like specters, hilly trolls on towers. I really like her for the Overworld a lot, actually. Being able to play AFK is really nice. You can use her for auto battler mode along with Farina. You know, if you use Zhongli, Farina, and Yae, you can auto battle. Probably got a healer in there of some kind, so that's pretty funny. Maybe Baiju or something. But I think she's a great Overworld character and just a good solid character. I wish I like, she to me is like exactly where you want a character to be. Upgrade versus 4 stars and standard 5 stars for those certain things. Lots of flexible teams. No, she's not power creeping anything, but you can use her in a lot of places, and she's very strong and has, you know, some nice quality of life and ease of use. So let me know what you think of the Yae, and if you want to see where I put her on the tier list, make sure you check out my tier list video. Thanks so much. Bye for now.